Hi everyone. So I was scrolling through TikTok the other day and I came across a lawyer who was warning people against taking images of people, taking photographs of people, and then posting them online without their permission. And he was looking at the dire consequences and the fines that you might get slapped with if you do that. And so, because it kind of interested me, I started scrolling down the comments and I came across this question that someone asked the lawyer. He said, I heard a photo belongs to a photographer or whoever captured that photo. Now, this is a big issue with photography. Who owns the copyright to the photo that you take? Let's look at the two laws that actually govern that aspect of photography. The question that the guy was asking about who owns the image is actually covered under copyright law, under the laws of Kenya, and that is CAP 130. What the lawyer was talking about is covered under a different law, which is the Data Protection Act, and that is CAP 411C. So let's kind of look at them and see what each of them says. In short, the copyright law grants the copyright to the photographer. And you'll find this under Section 31 of that particular act. And according to that section, the copyright is given to the author, in this case, the photographer, the person who is responsible for the composition of the photograph. And that is the person that has the copyright. So if you create a work of art, like taking a photograph, you have the following rights according to the law, and you can look this up for yourself. You can make copies, you can sell, you can rent, you can lease, you can hire, you can share it publicly. And that means either posting it online or showing it in public, and you can broadcast. One thing that's also included in the Copyright Act under Section 32 is that the photographer is granted what are called moral rights. Moral rights cover basically two things. One of them is the right for the author or the photographer to be recognized as the author of that work. And it doesn't really matter even if they've transferred the copyright ownership, they still have a right to be recognized as the authors of that work. The second one is that they have a right to object if the work is changed or used in such a manner that it damages or harms their name or reputation. And so that's very clear. If you take an image, you have the copyright. Now, there are two exceptions that I want to cover. One is when you are hired, let's say to cover an event or to cover something like a wedding, and you have signed a contract, then the copyright belongs to the person who hired you. It's very important to note the issue of contract. The second exception is when you are taking those photographs as part of your employment. So you are employed by an organization and you are taking photographs on behalf of that organization, then you don't have copyright for those images. The image copyright belongs to your employer. So that seems simple enough. The photographer has the rights to his images, has the rights to any image that he has photographed. But now let's look at what the Data Protection Act says. So this is the Data Protection Act of 2019 and CAP 411C. And it says a person's photograph is considered personal data if they can be identified from it. And so this law requires that you must get clear and informed consent before taking, using, or sharing someone's photo, especially for public, commercial, or online use. So this also includes telling the person what you're going to be using the photo for, and for children, you need permission from an adult. Additionally, if you give someone consent to use your image, you can revoke that consent at any time. You still reserve the right to say, I don't want my image to be used anymore, and that person who has taken the photograph is obliged to take it down. Now you can already see that there's a tension between these two laws, because the photographer has copyright, but the person who is being photographed also has rights that seem to be in conflict with the copyright law. So let's try and look at these two laws a bit more closely to see how they can be reconciled. There are three main areas where these two laws seem to either conflict or complement each other. The first area is the granting of the copyright itself. So the Copyright Act grants the creator the copyright with all its benefits. But whilst the photographer has the rights to the image, the Data Protection Act, on the other hand, protects personal data. And this includes identifiable images of individuals. Now, just a small point, this doesn't include people who accidentally appear in the background of photographs that are taken in public. This is also covered in the laws. The second area is that the Copyright Act allows the copyright holder to reproduce, publish, and use the work unless otherwise assigned. So basically, it seems to be saying they're allowed to do anything because they own the copyright. On the other hand, the Data Protection Act requires informed consent from individuals before using their image, especially if used publicly or commercially. Okay? And finally, the Copyright Act focuses on the ownership and economic rights of the image. So in this case, it's protecting the photographer and making sure that the photographer benefits from the work that they have done. On the other hand, the Data Protection Act focuses on the privacy and dignity of the person in the image. And these are very important distinctions to know as you try and reconcile these two laws. Just because you own the rights to an image doesn't mean you can use it in whichever way you want to use it. The person in the image also has rights that are protected under the law. The second legal issue is what they call the principle of concurrent compliance. And what this means under Kenyan law is that where two statutes apply to the same act, so like publishing a photo of someone, you have the copyright law and the data protection applying to the same, then both must be complied with. And so a photographer owns the photo, that's the Copyright Act, but must still get consent to use or publish it. And that is included under the Data Protection Act. So you need consent even though you own the image. What this means practically for the photographer is that you must always seek consent before you publish something publicly from the person who appears in the image. And the law even applies to property that may be identifiable in your photograph. You may need to seek consent from the owner of those properties or buildings. So contracts are the bridge between the copyright law and the data protection law. Here are three things that you need to be clear on when it comes to those contracts. One, you need to make it clear that the photographer retains the copyright for the image. You have to agree with the client and that they understand that. The second thing that you need to include in those contracts is that you need to get permission or consent for you to use those images. A lot of photographers want to build their profile, they want to build their portfolio, they want to advertise their business, and the work that they do is what they use. So in that contract, you need to include a clause that grants you permission to use those images. And sometimes even behind the scenes work. Some clients don't even want behind the scenes stuff to be posted that includes them. So you need to be very clear and rich in understanding with your client that you're going to be using these images for such and such a purpose, and they agree to that. And then finally, you also need to respect the client's right to revoke that consent at any time. So you don't have perpetual rights to use their images even though they've given you consent. They can withdraw that right at any time, and you need to be respectful of that and include it in the contract. One other thing that I had omitted when I first recorded this video was the fact that you need to agree with your client on the scope of the work. And what that means is you have to agree on what the images are going to be used for. And this becomes very serious if you're doing serious commercial work. So for example, I'll give a hypothetical example of someone who's hired to cover a wedding. The understanding with a wedding is that wedding photographs or wedding images are for personal use. So the person who you are shooting for is going to post them online, they're going to keep them as an archive and show to friends and so on. So let's say you've shot the wedding and you've delivered the photos that you agreed on, and then maybe a month down the line, you see the images that you took for the wedding on billboards all over Nairobi. You get to find out that the bride sold these images to some ad company, and they're now using those images as part of their ad campaign for one thing or the other. According to the law, this now falls outside the scope of what you were originally hired to take those images for. In this case, as a photographer, you actually have a right to object, and you have a right to be compensated for what those images are now being used for, which is outside the scope of the original contract. But to be on the safe side, you need to have these kinds of things written in the contract to avoid misunderstandings later on. So in conclusion, whilst copyright gives you the right to own and control the image you create, the data protection law limits how you can use that image when it features an identifiable person. So to stay compliant as a photographer, make sure you always pair copyright laws with data subject consent. Consent is the big issue here, and that's how those two laws can work together and keep you out of trouble. There are a lot more things we could say about the copyright law and the data protection, and a lot of photographers have some nasty experiences with clients in that regard. So if you have any experiences, or you are a lawyer, or you have more information that you can shed light on these two laws, please share that in the comments, and let's start a conversation on these two issues that are very important for photographers.